Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to talk about fishing line. Not all fishing lines are created equal, but with hundreds of options on the shelf, it's hard to know which one to pick to get the best performance for your baits. So today we're going to talk about what fishing lines you need to be using to catch more fish while you're out there on the water. So stay tuned, we're going to get right into it. So when you walk into your tackle shop, you're going to see hundreds of options of fishing line, and it's hard to choose which one is right for the baits that you're throwing. There's going to be different types of line, brands, pound test. We're going to talk about some of that later in today's video. But what I really want to talk about today is that there are 4 types of fishing line to choose from. So you're going to have braided line, you're going to have fluorocarbon, you're going to have monofilament, and then there's actually one that's called copolymer, which is an interesting one. So we'll get into that towards the end of today's video. But let's start. We're going to talk about braided line first and what its properties are and what it's best for. So the reason that we're starting with braided line first is that it's the most different from the other 3 types of line we're going to talk about in today's video. The first obvious difference is that it's actually a solid color and you can't see through it or it looks clear like some of the other lines on the shelf. It actually will show up in the water and it's much more visible. That's not a bad thing, especially because braided line is most used in the grass. That's where it excels the most. And it's a light or dark green color usually, so it blends right in with the cover that you're fishing, and the fish really won't see it anyway. The other thing you can do to combat the color issue is to tie a leader on, so you get the benefits of the braid as your main line, and then the last 6 foot or so of your line would be a clear fluorocarbon or monofilament leader, so the fish can't see your line anyway, making sure you still get the most amount of bites possible. Now, braided line is created in a process exactly as the name says, where they take multiple strands of fishing line and essentially braid them together, making a much stronger fishing line. So when you look at braided line compared to other line on the shelf, you're going to see much higher pound test ratings. Like I fish 65-pound braid a lot, and that seems like a lot for bass, but when you actually look at it, this is only about the thickness of 17-pound test monofilament. So it's not a very thick line, but has much more strength. And that is good for, like we talked about, fishing in the grass. When you set the hook on a fish and it buries you in the grass, you don't break off as easy and you can saw your way through the grass, which is what the braid is used for, and cut through the grass and pull the fish in and make sure you land that even if it's buried in heavy cover. 2 other very important properties of braid is its memory. Memory in line is what happens when you get those coils as your line stays on the spool for a long time. Braid has 0 memory. It will always stay straight. It's always a very limp line. You can leave this on a reel for 5 years and it would still perform the same way it did on day 1 of putting it on the reel. It does not matter. So this line lasts forever. So that's actually a very nice feature for somebody fishing on a budget. While this is a little more expensive than other types of line on the shelf, it will last you much longer. At the end, you won't have to change your line as often. The other thing that braid does really well because of the way it's designed is it has very good sensitivity. You can feel everything with braid because there's no stretch to it. You can't stretch this line at all. It's a direct connection to the fish, so you get very good hook sets. You can feel every bite, and it will just allow you to know if your bait is performing properly under the water at all times. And the last key feature of braided line is that it actually floats, so it works very well for fishing any type of topwater lure, from frogs to walk the dog baits, poppers, whopper ploppers. All of that works excellent on braided line. So what other kind of lures do I like to fish on braid besides topwater lures? I will fish anything in the grass, so a swim jig works excellent on braided line, a frog works excellent on braided line, punching mats or flipping any type of vegetation, lily pads, stuff like that. And ultimately, my favorite way to use braided line is to actually put it on my spinning reels, which I'm going to do a more detailed video on later because there's so many benefits to talk about. But essentially, it works very well for finesse fishing techniques with that leader application we talked about to make sure you're feeling everything those small baits are doing down there on the bottom. The next line up that we're going to talk about is actually going to be fluorocarbon, and this is going to be the most expensive line you can buy, but for good reason. Fluorocarbon has a few good properties to it that make it more expensive than everything else, but the most popular reason is its invisibility factor. Obviously, no fishing line is ever invisible, but what happens is light bounces off the line and reflects back, making it ultra clear under the water, more clear than any other line you can buy, which will get you more bites at the end of the day. A couple other things fluorocarbon does that other lines do not is it has less stretch than monofilament or copolymer that we're going to talk about later, but it does not have no stretch like Braid. But that makes it more sensitive than those other two lines we're going to talk about here in a little bit. The other thing fluorocarbon does that the other lines do not do at all is it actually sinks. It's the only line that sinks. And what that does is not only does it allow you to get baits down to the bottom, so it works very well for anything you fish on the bottom like jigs, Carolina rigs, Texas rigs, anything like that, but it also excels at crankbait fishing. This is a very good crankbait line. It has just the right amount of stretch to be able to get those fish to get the bait in their mouth, but it also allows your crankbaits to get to their maximum diving depth and really get down to where the fish are, where mono might cut off a foot or two from the diving depth that it's actually labeled on the package. The other thing that this does really well is fish around hard cover like rocks and wood, because it is the most abrasion resistant out of all the fishing lines. You can even get fluorocarbon specifically designed to have extra abrasion coating on it to really make sure it stands up to the different types of cover that are down there on the bottom. When I'm fishing on Lake Erie around zebra mussels, you must have fluorocarbon up there. It is the most durable line against the zebra mussels, and it still gets cut off. So that's why I use fluorocarbon for a lot of my fishing. The only thing fluorocarbon cannot do is fish in very heavy grass and fish topwater lures since it sinks. So those are the only two purposes I will not use fluorocarbon line. The next type of fishing line we're going to talk about is probably the most widely used fishing line. Probably every one of you have used this at some point in your life, and that is monofilament fishing line. It is the cheapest available, and it pretty much works for a lot of the stuff that we're going to do in bass fishing. Now, a couple properties of monofilament fishing line is it floats like braided line. It also has extra stretch compared to the other fishing lines, so it is the one that stretches more than any other, but it's good to allow fish to really get the bait into their mouth, which we'll talk about here in a second on some of the baits that I like to use specifically for mono, even though it's cheaper line. Also, monofilament is clear, so it does not show up as well in the water, but it does show up a little bit better than fluorocarbon. If you actually put these side by side on the spools, you can see that you'll almost be able to see through the line to the spool on fluorocarbon, where on the mono, it will reflect the light and still look clear, but it's kind of opaque-ish where you can't see through the line as well. Not a big deal when you're fishing. Like I said, this is probably half to a quarter of the price, depending on the brand you buy, of fluorocarbon, so it's much more affordable, and it's not going to make as big of a deal at the end of the day with just a little bit of color to the line. It's still clear. One thing you will notice with monofilament fishing lines is it will have memory. Like we talked about with the Braid, where you won't get those coils when it sits on your reel, that will happen with monofilament. And depending on the quality of monofilament you're buying, it can happen very quickly and you'll have to change your line very often. But one thing you can use for monofilament, copolymer, and fluorocarbon is use the Kevin Van Dam's line and lure. It's just a spray application you can spray onto the spool of your reel once your line is spooled up on there. It will lubricate the line and allow it to have less memory over time. It will not cure it forever, but it will make it perform better for a little bit longer than it would if you did not use this stuff. So I spray this on once I spool my reel up, maybe once every month, and then just kind of let it go from there. And once it gets all coily, I'll change my line. So the type of baits that I will specifically fish on monofilament fishing line is your topwaters again. Poppers, whopper ploppers, and walking baits, and prop baits even, are very good on monofilament because they have all the treble hooks. So when you're walking the dog back and forth, since this doesn't flex as much as Braid does, you're less likely to get tangled up in the treble hooks and ruin a good cast because your bait is all messed up from the line getting wrapped around the hooks. The other thing that I do with monofilament fishing line is fish my big swim baits with it. You're fishing such a big bait that those fish need time to really get that bait into their mouth. So if you fish monofilament line, since it has more stretch, and you're typically using a heavier rod because the baits weigh so much, it gives that fish enough time to stretch that line out and get that bait into its mouth so you can really get a good hook set on those big swim baits. The last thing that I really like to do with monofilament fishing line is, since it does float, and since it's thicker than fluorocarbon typically in diameter, you can go up in line size and get a crankbait to run shallower than it says on the package. So if you have a crankbait that you really like that dives 8 foot deep and you put it on 15-pound mono instead of 10-pound fluorocarbon, it will actually run like 5 foot deep. So you can fish that crankbait in areas where those fish have never seen that crankbait before, because typically that bait would be too deep of a diver for that area. And the last type of fishing line we're going to talk about in today's video is that copolymer I mentioned earlier in today's video. If you don't know what copolymer is, it's almost like the best of both worlds. I've fished with copolymer for a very long time, especially through college fishing when I was fishing on a budget. What copolymer is monofilament fishing line that has the fluorocarbon coating on it. So it has the properties of monofilament, but it still gets that invisibility factor of fluorocarbon. So you can still get more bites, and it's a little bit better than just regular monofilament. It doesn't run much more in price. This is a 600-yard spool right here. I bought it for $10. Since you do have to change your line often, it's nice that it's kind of cheap, so you can just change your line more and get the sensitivity you need, and then take it off and put new stuff on, rather than feeling bad for taking $20 in fluorocarbon off your rod. Like I said though, with mono, you're going to have stretch, you're going to have it float, you're going to have memory on it, but you will still have that fluorocarbon coating that makes it invisible when it's under the water. And because this is coated in fluorocarbon, you will get two other things that fluorocarbon does in this line as well. You will get a little extra sensitivity because since it's coated, it will kind of take a little bit of stretch out of the mono, but not all of it, so just a little bit more sensitive than your standard mono. And you will also get that abrasion resistance factor that you don't get as well in monofilament. At the end of the day though, this is still monofilament. It's just a more premium monofilament than you would buy like your standard monofilament. It will run a little bit more expensive in price, but not by much. Like I said, this is only a $10 spool of line, where monofilament this might be like $6, but it is still a little bit better than what you could buy with your standard monofilament. If you're fishing on a budget, you do need to check this stuff out. Like I said, I fished with this for 4 years through college fishing because I could not afford fluorocarbon, and I still caught fish with it. It works very well. It works. It was my do everything line for a while. The only other thing I bought besides this was braided line to be able to fish in the grass. That's the only thing that this won't do. You will not be able to fish in the grass with this. And if you enjoyed today's video talking about fishing line, go ahead and check out this video right here where I talked about a secret little Senko trick that I do that will allow you to get more bites in the grass in heavy cover. So if you're interested in that, check that out, and head down below and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss my weekly fishing tips coming up.